Hello, everyone. Can y'all hear me? Cool. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our event for the NGO Committee on the Status of Women's 65th Virtual Forum. My name is Ashley Muka, and I am a Master's of Social Work student. I'm also a Master's of Public Health student at NYU, and I'm one of 4 academic interns here at the Unitarian Universalist office at the United Nations. So as you all know, this is our event, The Right to Joy. We had a little bit of a name change. It's The Right to Joy, LGBTQ Women of Color, and just against insurmountable challenges, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer women of color have really persevered despite multiple intricate threats to their humanity and their human rights. And so this NGO CSW 65 parallel event seeks to affirm their acts of resistance amid adversity and celebrate the multifaceted identities of LGBTQ women of color globally. And so through Audre Lorde's concept of radical self-care, we will learn the significance of claiming joy within this community for resilience building and intensive healing. And our panelists will share what joy means to them, ways to sustain the vibrance of the LGBTQ community, and how we can exercise self-preservation as a tool for social justice. And so as we just rejoice through the trials and tribulations, the UUA at UN hopes to help protect LGBTQ women of color worldwide. And so we encourage your participation through the chat, and we're gonna have a really, really great discussion on the joys of being an LGBTQ woman of color.
Hello, everyone. I'm Shanice Bryant. I am also an academic intern with the UUA, and I'm a Master's of Social Work candidate at New York University. The Unitarian Universalist Association Office at the United Nations is a non-governmental organization in association with the United Nations Department of Global Communications. Through targeted education, advocacy, and outreach, we engage Unitarian Universalists in support of international cooperation and the work of the UN. The Unitarian Universalist Association Office at the UN values diversity and sexuality and gender, advocating for the rights of people of all sexual orientations and gender identities globally. This year, during this NGO, we are focusing on the status of women for LGBTQ plus women of color. Some of our staff that's in attendance right now is Bruce Knotts, our director of the UUA, Allison Hess, Rob Kipp, and we also have 2 other academic interns, Lena and Noorjahan. I'm going to bring us into our main discussion with our first speaker, Ms. Sontaia Briggs. And to briefly introduce her, Sontaia P. Briggs is the founder of U University, an online ministry uplifting and affirming the gifts of youth and young adults, as well as providing in-person college success, access coaching, and counseling. A consultant working with nonprofits and churches, Sontaia authors youth and young adult programs and workshops. She is sought after LGBTQIA inclusion trainer and motivational speaker who has worked with Parity NYC, Blatant Peel Institute and Counseling Center, Park United Methodist Church, and North Manhattan Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Sontaia holds a Master's of Public Administration from Rutgers University and a Master's of Art and Youth Ministry from New York Theological Seminary. She is also a producer of 2 independent feature films, a webinar series, and co-creator of a limited podcast series. Everyone, please welcome Ms. Sontaia.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much to the UUA office at the UN. Thank you guys for having me here and having this conversation, which is extremely important. And as I prepared for today and thought and played around with the idea of what joy was and what that looked like in my mind, and then around LGBTQ women of color, I realized that joy is embodied, right? And joy also, it's sometimes used interchangeably with happiness, but I say embodied because happiness is something that happens when an external cause or an external stimulation. But with joy, it's an internal stimulation. And what that, and how specifically that relates to LGBTQ people and women of color is there's a grace and an acceptance within ourselves that we have to come to. Me being a Black lesbian woman, those are the words that I'll just use. And just because in society, LGBTQ, we have no, when you're a woman of color, it's no or not yet. So through our how we navigate the world, we have to come to this place where we accept ourselves, and then we have to show up. So joy is also presence, right? And then I would say radical presence, because you're also putting yourself, or you're going places where people aren't welcoming you. And for me, my particular compass and how I navigate my joy is my faith. I identify with the Christian faith. And so it's how I show up in, essentially, in this body and in this location. When people interact with me, I'm pretty much going against what they've been given. They're like embodied or embedded theologies or whatever the case may be. So I have to show up in this space as a representation of God, and then what God looks like to me. And that is my diversity, which I believe is our diversity is divine. So joy is also divinity, and being a person of a diverse, identity, disruptive of the binary, disruptive of these things that we were given. When I show up in this space, I'm giving radical presence, right? And I'm also displaying my joy, which is divine, which is inside of me, which is what these are the things. This is how God created me, and this can, be difficult because, faith is so personal for people, but also in disruption, everything that we know about God and our experiences, and to get to joy, there is disruption. There's disruption of these different ideas or the way that people interact with the world that are, that are given to us, these heteronormatives, black, white, male, gay, straight. And so my presence is a disruption of that. And that disruption is also joy, because the only thing I can do is just navigate in these spaces, in this sort of a waiting room that we have, with this joy or with my identity, but also this grace, which I feel like in this location that I occupy, I have a lens. And I consider it like a superpower. Like queer people, we have a superpower, this lens of sitting in this space where we intersect sometimes with all these different marginalities, which also gives us this kind of graceful joy that we can expand and that we can give to other people. And we embody it so they see it. So it's not just an idea. It's not external. It's very much internal, and it's something that I have to give out. And as far as with resistance and with self-care, in our community, we build communities, we build our families. Our given families are, sometimes they're supportive, sometimes they're not. And in the case where they're not supportive, we just end up having a natural community. You have an older person that is either like an uncle to you or like a mother. For me, I have people who are maybe 10 years younger than me, they're like little cousins, but there's all this informal family and all this informal community building, which ends up being very strong because we have to be self-advocating for ourselves. So these are acts of joy. Like joy sometimes can be associated with like visual happiness, but sometimes it's actually the act of just showing up. It's the act of speaking, the act of being present, the act of extending grace. Often, sometimes when people aren't extending the grace to you, and then that's how they get there, and that's how I try to show up in the world. So joy was like, to try to like intellectualize it or articulate it is a little bit difficult, because it's presence. Like the whole forming of this event, this panel, this is an act of joy, and this is also radical, and these two things are together, because generally with joy, this being an internal experience based on your life or the different things that you're navigating, it's something that you constantly are churning within yourself, just by the people that you come into contact, just by ideas that you come into conflict with. And conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. Conflict can also, disagreement, I believe, breeds innovation and breeds birth. And these are also the seeds of joy as well. So to put it like in 5 or 6 words, I really couldn't do it, but I know it's embodied, right? I know it's presence, radical presence, because particularly the space that we're occupying, or the people that we're speaking about today, you're going places where people are not necessarily welcoming you, or your presence is, I would say, it's just coming up against something that is in disagreement with what they've been given. And then this grace, this amazing grace that we often have to extend, but the grace that we extend it ourselves, because we have to affirm ourselves first, and then it spreads out. So those are some of the ideas that I have around joy, and joy particularly in this experience. And I just, our superpower as being LGBTQ, a woman of color, being a person that can stand in one position of a room and just have a vantage point to a lot of experiences because we come into contact with so much.
Thank you so much. And I have a follow-up question for you. Knowing the
Sure.
struggle of Black women and the fact that so many religious institutions having different ideologies regarding sexuality and gender, how do you work through those challenges spiritually and find joy in them?
Well, so the first thing I do is when I come into contact with people who have these sort of embedded theologies, which could be toxic for my identity, I remember that faith and religion and belief is extremely personal. And before it's developed, like you develop it, your own self-development is something that's given to you. And what we have in faith communities, which is really natural and beautiful, is community. And in community, as you, from being young to growing up in your community, is your identity. So what I try to take a moment and remember is my presence and my being is coming into conflict with your identity. And that could be shattering, right? That could be disruptive. So it's an interesting space to navigate because I'm having to extend the grace that I was speaking to folks who may not necessarily want to extend grace to me, but I also remember how personal faith and religion is to people. So then I understand because they're fighting for what they believe, just like I'm fighting for what I believe. But then what I also present is the suggestion, right? Because you want to suggest something and allow a person to think about it on their own, that God is bigger than maybe the ideology or the theology that you've been given. And if we can agree on, one simple thing that, God does miracles, if you accept the idea of miracles and God doing miracles, then we know that God is infinite, right? And we are finite. So we understand things in a finite way. But if you can accept that God is omnipresent, supernatural, omnipotent, and does miracles, then maybe go a little further and accept that God knew what God was doing when God created all people. And the only God that matches this omnipotence or this omnipresence is a God of all. So the Imago Dei God. And that's just sort of what I try to push back with. Like, we accept that God is greater than our own perception. So in this one particular area of people, God can't be small again. So it's either your God is big or infinite, or your God is small. So that's sort of how I try to navigate that space.
That was beautifully worded. I think another thing that resonated with your speech is when you said how joy is not something you can put into words. It's just the presence or just being in the radical presence of being that. And also just showing and giving those grace who may disagree with how you identify or who you choose to love. I think that's something that's very hard for society to do, especially when these are people who are causing harm to us or to our community. So thank you so much for that.
Yes. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sontaia. So our next panelist, as you may all know, is Ms. Pauline Park, I'm sorry. So Pauline Park is a world-renowned transgender activist and writer based in New York City. She is the president and board of directors and former executive director of Queens Pride House and the chair of the New York Association for Gender Rights Advocacy, both of which she co-founded. In 2002, Pauline served as coordinator of the work group, which led to the campaign for transgender rights law enacted by New York City Council. In 2010, Pauline negotiated the inclusion of gender identity and expression in the Dignity for All Students Act, DASA, a safe school bill enacted by the New York State legislature. In 2012, she was named one of the most influential LGBTQ Asian icons by the Huffington Post and added to a list of top 50 transgender icons for Transgender Day of Remembrance. Everyone, join me in welcoming Pauline.
Thanks so much, Ashley. Thanks to you and Shanice and Bruce, UNO, and everyone else for inviting me. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I'm honored to join Sontaia, and I really found her comments very, very inspiring and thoughtful. So I was thinking about joy and how important it is at this particular moment. One could strike a somewhat Dickensian note and say it's the best of times and the worst of times. I think it's really important because on the one hand, it is important to note all of the, the pervasive discrimination, harassment, abuse, and violence that LGBTQ people of color face. Just yesterday, I heard about a transgendered African-American woman in Ohio who was murdered. We need to note that, but we also at the same time need to come together in community and share joy, because that's what's going to sustain us. It's going to sustain us through difficult times, both personally and politically. And I was thinking about what joy meant for me, and it occurred to me that there were a few things that I could specifically mention. Food, travel, writing, and music. So food is kind of universal, right? We all eat. And I had one friend who once asked me, do you post everything you eat on Facebook? Because I post a lot of food pics, right? And the answer was no, only the interesting stuff. But one of the things that I thought about after she asked that very, nice, friendly question was, well, so why do I post food pics, right? There's kind of a, the superficial reason is because I like to show what I'm eating, but the deeper reason is really, it is kind of an act of appreciation, actually. It is actually a way of honoring the provider of the food. And by provider, I mean both the divine spirit, but also the people who labor in the fields and the vineyards to produce our food. And it's also kind of an act, it's kind of a Zen act, really, because you're in the moment thinking about how you are consuming a product that someone else produces, because unless you're a farmer, you don't grow your own food. And, there are only 3% of us who are farmers. And it's also a way of making art out of our daily lives. Then travel, I have friends who think I'm constantly traveling. That's, I think, only because I'm constantly posting old travel pics on Facebook and Twitter. But my last big trip, I actually spent 5 weeks in Europe in 2017. But travel has been very important. I went back to Korea for the first time since I was adopted at the age of 7.5 months back in 2015. And that was a hugely important experience for me. I participated in the first US LGBTQ delegation tour of Palestine back in January 2012. And that was one of the most difficult, but one of the most ultimately rewarding, not to say educational, trips that I've ever taken. Writing, even before I got into activism way back in 1994, I was writing, and I actually think of myself as a writer as much as an activist. And I just started to write poetry, which is really new for me. That's as of about a month ago. And finally, music. Anatole France famously wrote that all the arts aspire to the condition of music. And there's something really divinely transcendental about music at its best. And one of the things that I do, I try to do every day, I sometimes miss a day or two, is play piano and sing. And I love accompanying myself on the piano. I think really since last year, but especially because of the pandemic, I've been delving deeper and deeper into the lieder tradition. And so let's see, Franz Schubert here, Schubert lieder, which thinking about the pandemic to me is kind of like Winterreise, which is his last song cycle, A Winter's Journey. And it ends somewhat ambiguously, but one could read the last song as being about death. So when we think about yesterday, I think was the first anniversary of the first death here in New York City of someone from the coronavirus. I think it's really important for us to struggle with what all of this means. And I have had moments of depression and despair myself, but then I think about what there is to live for, both in my own life and for the various struggles that I'm involved with. I wanted to just read one passage because last night before I went to bed, I happened onto a video on YouTube of one of those beautiful duets that Handel wrote in an opera called Sosarme. He loved the duet so much that he actually used it in 3 different operas. And I'll just read a teeny tiny bit of it because it kind of, I think, sums up what I've been talking about here. I'll read the English translation and then I'll read the Italian because it's so beautiful. Through the gates of suffering, souls must pass to finally gain pleasure. Contentment stands at the edge of grief. There is no rose without thorns, nor pleasure without suffering. Per le porte del tormento passano l'anime a gioir. Sta il contento del cordoglio sul confine, non v'è rosa senza spine, né piacere senza martir. And to me, that just sort of says it all. I'm a big opera queen, by the way. And it just brings together both joy and sorrow and shows the pathway from sorrow and grief and torment to joy. And if you go on YouTube, you can find it, Per le porte del tormento. And it's really quite an extraordinary passage with the most extraordinary music. And it seems to me like a fitting metaphor for the passage that we're all going through right now in various ways with regard to this pandemic.
Thank you so much, Pauline. And I think that really resonates with all of us. I feel like with the pandemic, we either had to find new ways to engage in self-care or, we just saw the importance of self-care, particularly with so much mourning, with so much collective grief and shared trauma. So I just have one question for you. So as a well-known advocate of transgender rights, do you believe that we have an obligation to create spaces, resources, and organizations that center the self-care of LGBTQ women of color, specifically trans women?
Oh, I think we certainly do. I think that what we need to do is form spaces relevant to particular tasks and missions. And how those are configured will depend on the task or the mission. It could be temporary, it could be long-term, it could focus specifically on the trans community, even transgender people of color. It could be LGBT people of color. It could be specific to particular racial or ethnic groups. It depends on the purpose or the mission of the group or the project, but it's really vital to have spaces like that. Some, I think, will legitimately be safe spaces for particular populations, and others could be open to everyone, even if centered on particular groups of people or communities.
Yes, I believe that as well. I feel like having affinity groups during work hours or having caucus groups or really having, closed sessions for people in community to come together is something that's really important for the self-care and joy of LGBTQ women of color. So thank you for that.
Sure.
So for our next portion, we will be watching a brief video from the PBS Digital Studios First Person LGBTQ Forum, in which activist, designer, and healthcare worker Nala Simone Toussaint works to celebrate the beauty of others and invigorate their self-esteem through living her truth as a Black trans woman and empowering other trans and gender non-conforming youth. So as we watch, just reflect on the ways in which LGBTQ women of color must affirm their own identities against just the harmful stereotypes and projections of others, and find ways to experience joy for themselves. And then afterwards, we will be discussing the video for about 10 minutes.
I knew that there was something different from what other people were saying I was. So oftentimes folks were like telling me what sexuality I should be. So I was living through their truth. For example, like mom was like, yeah, you're gonna find a good girl, you're gonna get married and all this stuff. I'm like, okay, yeah, that doesn't resonate with me.
So did you initially come out as gay first?
I would say yes, and only because that's what folks were telling me, because I was very feminine. I carried myself that folks were like, oh, you're definitely gay. I'm like, oh, okay. But I knew I was attracted to guys. I'm like, well, then maybe that's it. If folks are saying, this is how you identify and this is who you are, and I'm attracted to a specific gender, then yeah. And at the time I dated girls just to be like, oh, I'm gonna date girls so everyone can get off my back, but and that wasn't my truth. That was like trying to please other folks. It wasn't literally until college where I was able to like just peel off the mask of trying to pretend to be other folks and make other folks happy.
And how was it coming out to your family and friends as gay initially?
At 17, I will never forget this day. I was literally at the computer and I was watching the ballroom scene videos. So I was watching it. I was like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna tell my mom, I'm gonna come out. This is my coming out story. So I'm like, Mom, there's something different. I'm gay. This is the hardest thing I have to tell you. So she was like, and she just sat and she just stared and she sat. She's like, okay, that's it. All right, let's go with this. I was like, oh, you're okay with it? She's like, well, I would prefer you to be straight, but you only have one life to live, so you have to live it your way. Like, literally, that's what she said. And I was like, oh, okay. So she was like, how you say, the grounding rock for me. Mm-hmm. So my goal was always to make her happy and make her pleased and make sure that she's proud of me. And then college came, right? And then that's when, like, I was like, well, no, gay wasn't the right term. My school wasn't talking, or the Brooklyn school weren't talking about gender identity, sexual education, and sexual orientation, all these things. It was literally through college. There was a student who I saw her, I was like, yes. I didn't know anything about her, but there was something about me that was connected to her. And I started talking with her, and then I found out she was trans, and I was like, yes, that's how I feel. That resonates with me. So then I started going to the doctor and then figuring out the next steps into my journey.
So you got into fashion.
Yes.
And were you able to use fashion as a tool to build self-confidence, being a trans woman of color?
Right. So I think fashion for me just helped me to like get into this world where you get to understand art in a way that allows you to express, but through art and expression, I was able to actually find identity. But when graduating and actually entering the fashion world, it was a wake-up call for me. I will say that, in being totally honest and authentic. And I have to name it, it's very important. Like, the fashion world glorifies a certain type of person, right? And still it wasn't reflective of me, right? A Black, trans, Caribbean girl. So trying to navigate that was difficult. So eventually I was like, I need to do something that's going to impact me and the world, and really have intentional conversations about not just diversion, but really inclusion and what it looks like to actually see it. So my goal has been the interruptions within a nonprofit organization and how we have conversation with trans, how I uplift my trans sisters, my trans patients, to understand, like, you know, you don't get to just give up, but you get to like tell folks like, this is who I am and we're gonna work through this together, right? I want you to learn about me, and it's not always my job to teach folks about who I am, right? We have Google. We're 2017, right?
You do so much amazing work, right? And it's really building conversations that lead to change. Could you sort of talk about what the role or purpose of an ally and accomplice is? Or
Okay, so ally for me is that person who understands the privilege that they may have in spaces to actually step in. And like, for example, so if we're walking and someone is, making slurs or transphobic slurs, it's for someone to step in and say, wait, how can I support this person? How can I remove? It's not being silent when these things are happening. It's really like, it's almost like how you would treat your family or your best friend. You don't want anything bad to happen to this person. You want this person to be able to be in a space where they can exist. So allyship for me, it's actually saying, you know what, I see you, and what do you need that I can support you with? And that's like showing up. It's how to be siblings, right? Not just allies, but these are your siblings, and there are policy and laws that does not support your sibling. So how can you be an ally and actually support getting policies that uplift and are intentional to creating spaces where trans folks can actually be?
my final question for you is, what advice would you give to younger generations of trans and gender nonconforming youth?
So if it's one thing I would say is that you matter, continue to strive, continue to say yes to yourself, and allow yourself to be. Even when the world says no, allow yourself to be.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure having you here. That is all the time that we have for this episode. But if you have any questions for us, please leave your questions and comments in the comment section below. We want to engage with you, and so that we can engage all together and further the conversations. If you haven't already, to see more episodes, please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to follow us on all social media at First Person PBS. So thank you. That's it. Goodbye.
That was a beautiful video of Nala Simone Toussaint discussing what life is like for her as a Black trans woman and just navigating her self-esteem and gender nonconforming youth in her adolescence. So I'm gonna ask, what is a reflection for our speakers? Like, how did the video make you feel, and what are your thoughts on it?
I really liked the piece about like viewing others, like wanting to be viewed and viewing others as brothers and sisters. And it made me think about if we get holistic, or if we think about faith or God, that we are a community of the created. So we are brothers and sisters. So that was really a big takeaway for me. It's just acknowledging what is actually already true. We are a community of the created. We are brothers and sisters. We are in a family, a human family together. So I thought that was a really good point.
I thought it was great. I think that this is a perfect example of someone who's empowering herself, in this case through fashion. And even though she faced many obstacles, she ultimately found a path forward that was self-empowering and that actually was creative and connected to other people.
Yeah, I really liked how her mother was supportive, because Sontaia, as you were saying, the importance of chosen family in the LGBTQ community cannot be understated, especially because a lot of families are not as welcoming. But Nala's family, her mother just immediately took up arms with her and was willing to kind of readjust what she thought for her life in a way that aligns more so with Nala's vision. So I was very, very pleased to see that in the video. And so now we will open it up to audience members. Feel free to raise your hand and we will unmute you so you can share your thoughts with us.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So I was listening to a comedian in New York lately, an old interview, but Michael Shea was saying, reflecting on the Black Lives Matter movement and saying in an American context, people of color have been asking for like white people and structures of oppression to acknowledge their lives as important. And as a movement, we're done asking. We are like ready to demand, like to make these demands. So I was reflecting on the video and I recognize that it's our responsibility, like as a cisgender woman, to recognize trans women as my sisters in public spaces. But what do we do when we can't trust the community, I guess, would be my question. Because living in New York City, I do see a lot of like violence and oppression. And that would be my question, I guess, is what else can we do when we can't always trust and turn to the community?
I think I would say that when you're in a space and you don't know if you can trust the community or not, well, you are the community, and it might sound really simple, but just being present and just how you're here today, you're bringing that out, like bringing that up as a point of conversation, or just mentioning something, or not ignoring something that might be microaggressive or dismissive or whatever the case may be. And something else that I think too, which is we all kind of do it now, I think, with the pronouns, that's radical to me. Like that is a way of showing up in the space and saying, I acknowledge that there's more than just, this location to stand in, these are other locations as well. So sometimes I think the presence in you being the community, like being the first person to actually just show up, and then you'll realize there are other people there that probably want to say something or want to learn or want to be a part of what you're doing. So something like that, I would say.
Pauline, did you have thoughts that you want to share with us?
I think that each of us are situated in particular circumstances, and community is an ideal. Sometimes human beings, imperfect as we are, fall short of that ideal. And some community spaces end up not being as affirming or even safe as they purport to be. So I think it would depend on the particular circumstances, but I would certainly reach out to friends and loved ones and trusted colleagues if one finds oneself in a situation where a particular community space is not as affirming as one would like, or perhaps not even safe. And sadly enough, we've seen all too many instances where community space, whether that be LGBT or women's community or people of color, communities of color, are not actually entirely what they purport to be. Or perhaps they started out with high ideals, then kind of degenerated. And so I think it's really important that anyone who feels that they have been subjected to any kind of behavior that's not affirming and even potentially abusive, potentially even criminal, reach out and not stay silent, because it's likely that someone else has also been victimized or subjected to behavior that is not acceptable. So I think there's an ethic of accountability that we need to enforce. One could look to contemporary politics and the headlines of the day to see what happens when we fail to hold leaders accountable for their behavior, and how toxic environments, whether workplaces or community spaces, can become unsafe for community members. And so it's really vital that people speak out, reach out, hold leaders and organizers and organizations accountable in order to ensure that all these spaces are safe and affirming and welcoming and inclusive.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I believe that the language is kind of changing around safe spaces. I believe that now they're starting to call them brave spaces, because we can't always guarantee someone's safety. And even within the LGBTQ community, you know, there's still a lot of racism. There's still a lot of transphobia. So I would say that looking at spaces is not always inherently safe is one way to start. Just self-preservation, protecting yourself first. And I would say as allies, as cisgendered women, we can't be offended when someone who identifies as trans doesn't want to be in community with us because they've been harmed by cisgendered women. You know, in terms of women of color, you know, if they don't want to be around people who identify as white and LGBTQ, you know, there shouldn't be offense taken because they're trying to protect themselves by being around people that look like them, people that they know what they're going through. So I think in terms of community not always being safe, I think that we always have to make sure that we are keeping ourselves safe first. We always have to put the mask on first before you can put on the air mask for somebody else in terms of an airplane. So let's welcome Josephine.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Josephine Lukey. I'm with an organization called Campaign Life Coalition in Canada. And I'd just like to thank the commentary about grace. I agree that we should extend it to people whom we disagree with. My question is, if we're not going to base gender on biological sex, what should we base it on? How do we define what womanhood is, for instance, without falling into stereotypes? Essentially, what separates women from men?
I have a few thoughts if people would like to hear them. It's interesting because I got into a little bit of an argument on Facebook that's been known to happen about trans participation in sports with a friend who I actually thought understood this, but clearly didn't. Here's my perspective. I approach this from an intersectional feminist perspective, but also a social constructionist one. I think sex and gender are ultimately socially constructed. And the problem is we try to think through what is a sex-gender binary in the terms of the sex-gender binary, which we've thoroughly internalized. The 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein said that the purpose of philosophy was to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. I'm not a Wittgensteinian, but I love that quote because that is in fact what we're in so many times. We're trapped by the language, the linguistic conventions that we've inherited and internalized. And so the first point of departure for me would be to recognize that ultimately there actually aren't such things as men and women. It's just like races. We've socially constructed different racial groups, even though there's no actual biological basis or genetic basis for categorizing people by race, as Carol Linnaeus did in the 17th century. So first we have to think about ourselves as all members of one human race, which we have subdivided into various groups, including by sex or gender. We have to think about what it means to be inclusive, supportive, and affirming of everyone, and then look at very specific situations. Because I certainly would not go so far as to say we should simply eliminate sex or gender, because those are realities of the world. There are specific situations. I was actually called in to advise the state on a particular situation of a swimming pool in State Park, which is actually in Manhattan, and locker rooms, and whether transgendered people should use the locker rooms associated with their sex assigned at birth or their gender identity, right? So they're very concrete situations, and one cannot a priori say one size fits all. However, I think the starting point has to be an understanding that our society has imposed a sex gender binary on all of us. And we need to think outside that box in order to come up with progressive, inclusive, and affirming solutions. I know that's a kind of a long-winded answer, but I hope it answers your question.
Thank you so much for that. Let's go to the next question.
From our chat box, we have a question for both panelists. How can trans activists be visible without jeopardizing their security? And the follow-up to that, they said, this is especially so far for those in places that are unsafe, such as Africa. You want to be vocal, but you live in a rented house and have to protect your family.
I think I read that. That is a difficult question, and I will admit that I do not probably have an answer. But I would just go back to the community, and then this is where I suppose I guess allyship, because this is when you would need someone that is outside your experience and to the community that you're trying to get to open their mind or expand their mind. Sometimes we can take information from someone that is similar to ourselves. So I think that for the safety of the trans person, this is where your straight allies come in. This is where your other members of LGBTQ spectrum come in. So I would maybe that approach. There's an organization that I belong to, and we do a workshop every year in rural North Carolina, and it's dangerous in a sense for all of us to kind of be there collected and having this workshop, but we have, allies in the community, allies that are outside of our experience. And so that's how we're able to do this. And that in itself builds community for the people that are there after we leave, because there are people that live there, that's just where they live. And then we just come in and visit. So I would say the allyship might be important in that particular instance.
I think there are situations where individuals may find themselves in a position where they can't be visible. And so as Sontaia said, sometimes they have to rely on friends, allies, other community members. I think that in an ideal world, maybe we could all be out, but that's not actually a safe option for a lot of people in various communities, neighborhoods, cities, towns, countries around the world. Of course, in an ideal world, out would be meaningless because we all could be just who we are, regardless. So I think we have to take into account the particulars of the situation and recognize that some people are not in a position to be visible in the way that perhaps others might be.
Yeah, and particularly for Africa, I know that it is a very difficult situation over there in terms of a lot of anti-LGBTQ laws and policies that have devastating consequences of jail time, being detained, even being killed. And I think for me, it's helpful to both think about the origins of the anti-LGBTQ laws in terms of colonization, and knowing that that wasn't a natural law that just came out of nowhere. That was very much implemented when Africa was being exploited and continues to be exploited. And I think in our present day, I think the presence of social media, the presence of having this large global audience that is listening and is responsive, I think that can also help in terms of not wanting to be visible, but wanting to speak out, certainly using social media, really getting advocates involved, because once we're all talking about it, that's when change can start to occur.
Another question, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
Another question we have from the chat box was, what lessons do you think the queer community might have to teach the wider society, which in many areas is growing increasingly isolated and disconnected, about strengthening interpersonal relationships and rebuilding the social fabric?
Can I ask you to read that again? I'm sorry.
It says, what lessons do you think the queer community might have to teach the wider society, which in many areas is growing increasingly isolated and disconnected, about strengthening interpersonal relationships and rebuilding the social fabric?
I would say grace. I think that I've sort of leaned into that before, because even within our community, and Pauline alluded to this in her answer to a previous question, we might be in the LGBTQ community, but we are all having different experiences, based on race, location, education, access, privilege, all these different things. So I think that to function in the space where you're LGBTQ, and then so I'm a Black woman, born in an urban area, I had the benefit of being able to go to college, but that's not everybody's experience. But we're constantly interacting or intersecting with all these different experiences. So again, like I was saying, that kind of like queer lens vantage point for understanding. So I think like grace and the understanding, and then vision, because it's outside, like you're seeing so many different things. There are so many different experiences versus just this kind of binary existence. Perhaps I would say that.
I would say it strikes me that there are at least two lessons that could be drawn here. First, that blood is not necessarily thicker than water. A lot of LGBTQ people, unfortunately, are rejected by their birth families and find community through chosen families, families of choice, or families that they find real kinship with. And I think that's a lesson to the larger society. Even if you're not LGBTQ, you might have strained, distant relationships with your family of origin. And you might find friends to be your real community. I think the second lesson, situating it in a sort of socioeconomic and political context, is that at this late stage of capitalism, when we're facing atomized individualism, which is characteristic of neoliberal capitalism, there's a sociological concept of anomie, which is a kind of an alienation and isolation. And so I think community is the only healthy response to that anomie. We have to find not only just like-minded individuals, but real family of choice, as it were, and community, in order to combat the isolation that so many people find themselves in, whether LGBTQ or not, in our current circumstance. And of course, that isolation has only been deepened by the coronavirus pandemic.
Thank you so much. Do we have another question?
We do. One is from a counselor educator. She said, do you have any suggestions to better educate these students? My apologies, students in the LGBTQ community.
I don't know if I necessarily understand educate LGBTQ students in general education, or educate students on LGBTQ?
I believe in general education.
In general education? Well, I think everything, even I look at it in the same kind of concept with the church, is sort of you have to get consensus and a top down. So the principal has to agree that these things are important, then the teachers have to agree, and then that goes down to the student population. So there needs to be agreement from the top all the way down. And then those people themselves might actually need to be trained about the LGBTQ community. So I think it's a communal agreement has to happen, and then that's where education will improve.
I think that we have to, engage in a querying of the curriculum. There are school districts and cities and states where laws have been enacted or school boards have acted to entirely exclude mention of LGBTQ people. And so that has to be addressed. I actually wrote a piece that's on my website, paulinepark.com, called Transgendering the Academy, about ensuring transgender inclusion in higher education. But what I say in that piece, which was a talk I actually gave at Mills College several years back, is applicable to K through 12 public and private schools, as well as colleges and universities. I think that our curricula, school curricula in general, do a very bad job of educating us on the history of people of color in this country, as well as LGBTQ people. And we have to change the way we think about history, actually. I remember when I was in high school, I had one history class, and even though history is my favorite subject of all time, this was the most boring class I had in high school. It was taught by an older white man, heteronormative white man, who reduced American history to a kind of a platitudinous civics lesson. And so the history of slavery and Native American genocide kind of whipped by, and all the interesting parts, the struggle, was really, the politics really were taken out of politics. And so I think that when we talk about education, as Mark Twain once remarked, we can never confuse education with schooling, right? And so even in the context of formal education, it has to be about critical thinking that helps students challenge existing structures of authority, which most of the time are identical with existing structures of oppression. And so it's in part about introducing more material about LGBTQ people, but it's also in part about thinking critically, because just as we've seen with things like Women's History Month or Black History Month or Asian American History Month, which are all good things, they're all important, but they can be presented and communicated in a bland way that kind of drains them of their real political content. Because the reality is, this country has always been about struggle, even before the founding of the Republic. Oh, sorry, my phone has gone off. Struggle about slavery obviously was the most important issue, but struggle about so many other issues that war and peace throughout the history of this country that have been so vitally important to the future of the country, but that in school curriculum are simply taught as part of a civic religion. We can't get to the phone right now.
Yes, I completely agree. As someone who comes from the Bible Belt South in South Carolina, there is never any talk about the LGBTQ plus community in sexual education, or just period throughout our 12 years of schooling. Anything that goes against the heteronormative society is very taboo, and it's all rooted in Christianity in those politics. So I definitely think as we navigate against the abstinence-only sexual education or just education in general regarding gender identity and sexuality and becoming more inclusive, hopefully that can change the narrative as we get older and people become more accepting to these communities since they gotten it at a younger age. And another speaker we have is Leoida, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Yeah. So I had a kind of general question about if there's any like resources or particular things that you have read or that you think we should read if we're trying to become more educated about how to be good allies and just in general concerning these topics.
Hi. I'll just say this one book that I started reading. It's called Indecent Theology. And why I like it is one part of it that I have just recently got to. She's presenting, or she suggests an idea of theology as a sexual act. But what I like about that is it points out how our theologies are so tied to like the binary and how we understand God. And the book is called Indecent Theology, which is decent. And the book is, described as like vanilla, binary, this particular, heteronormative way. And indecent is radical and binary, disruptive. So I think it kind of, whether you're a person of faith or not, and I feel like faith just creeps into your life, whether your ideas, whether you actually are practicing or whatever the case may be. But all of it seems to stem back just this way we see the divine and how we got here is how it just sort of spills out and everything. So if we can disrupt that, and I think that book is really good for like just suggesting these ideas that even make me a little uncomfortable, even in the space that I occupy, and just disrupting this sort of thing that we've been given, sort of like the example that Pauline gave about that bottle, and like we could like break that bottle, like whether we want to or not, we're still always sort of looking at through that bottle, but to realize the bottle's there, you have to break it and get out of it. So Indecent Theology, I think it's provocative, but very, it'll give you something to play with, and it's interesting.
I just posted in the chat box links to 2 talks I gave. They're sort of different versions of the same talk. I gave some years back at the Pacific School of Religion about LGBTQ people and spirituality in the Asia Pacific region. And it's secondary research, not primary research, but secondary research about homoerotic traditions and what I call proto-transgeneral identities, identity formations in pre-modern Asian and Pacific Islander societies, although it applies equally to pre-modern African, European, and pre-Columbian American societies as well. There was almost always some sort of space for what Gilbert Hurt called in his famous book, Third Sex, Third Gender Subject Positions. And so the fact is that LGBTQ people have been written out of their own, the histories of their own communities and cultures of origin. And so what I argue in these 2 talks is that one has to understand this history in order to situate oneself as an LGBTQ person of color in a way that's not re-articulating a white discourse of LGBT identity. And that in order to claim our place in the sun, as it were, we have to reinsert ourselves in the dominant discourses and governing narratives of our communities and cultures of origin. And one of the dangers that I see in the LGBT community, and this is true especially for people who grow up in conservative religious traditions. I grew up in a Christian fundamentalist household, that they see coming out as LGBTQ as a rejection, not only of their religious tradition, but of all religion, right? And I think what's really important is to understand that, as Queer Nation said, famously, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. But as I like to say, it's not only that we are here and we are queer, we've been here and we've been queer for over 3,000 years, but you just forgot. And that is so true in the Asian context. You hear things, for example, from maybe older conservative Chinese, oh, homosexuality didn't exist in China until the British brought it in the 19th century. To which one might respond, so how did you get the expression, the cut sleeve and the half-eaten peach, which go back 2,000 years in Chinese history, which are euphemisms for homosexuality, right? And so I think one of the things that I've been trying to do with my writing and my speaking engagements is to help queer APIs understand that we've actually had a place in pre-modern Asian and Pacific Islander societies, but we've been rewritten out of that history. It's a hidden history or a forbidden history. And so to get to the nub of it with regard to religion, thinking of LGBT identity as being antithetical to religion and all religious tradition is actually falling into the trap that these conservative and even reactionary forces, not only in our society, but in other societies, have set up, which is this binary opposition, which is a false dichotomy, which is between people of faith and LGBTQ people, right? And unfortunately, the mainstream media are constantly re-articulating this binary opposition. Perhaps it's better today, but this was certainly true 10 or 20 years ago. Whenever you had discussion of LGBT rights, you'd have a gay white male activist who spoke purely in secular terms, and then you'd have some Christian fundamentalist saying, I stand for God and country, which sets up this, false dichotomy that there are no queer people of faith, or that homosexuality, bisexuality, transgender are all completely antithetical to all religious and spiritual tradition, when in fact, people that we might recognize as queer can be found in virtually every pre-modern society. I was doing some reading a year or two ago about Viking society. There's even a queer spiritual tradition in Viking society that actually, oddly enough, is rather similar to the Mudang tradition in pre-modern Korean society. So I think we have to educate ourselves, and that form of education, which may not come in the context of formal schooling, in fact, it almost certainly won't, because this kind of queer history is taught almost nowhere in colleges or universities, much less K through 12. But it's that kind of education that can be truly empowering. When you see, for example, pre-modern African spiritual traditions, which then migrated on slave ships, basically, with enslaved Africans to the Americas, Candomblé and Santeria, for example, just to cite two examples. Pre-modern spiritual traditions in Mesoamerica, where you have, to this day, indigenous people who, for example, in Maya communities, identify as third sex or third gender. So this is the kind of real education that I think is important, especially for queer people of color, to understand ourselves in a context that's not part of the white dominant mainstream LGBTQ political discourse.
Thank you so much for that. All those different resources and really connecting our present back to our history. Because if we don't know our history, we can't learn for our future. So as we wrap up, we have one last question for you both. How can LGBTQ women of color deal with negative feelings and guilt that often comes with radical self-care and self-preservation? How can we shift from seeing joy as indulgent to necessary for our survival?
Sontaia, why don't you go first?
Okay. I think when I thought about that question, and you think about just the title of this forum, the right to joy, like self-preservation, self-care is a right. And whatever you have to give, you won't have it unless you take care of yourself. Like by nature, we're communal, we're pastoral people. Is in our nature to care for one another, and it's the same care that you have to even turn back on yourself. So even though culturally, you know, we that like the idea of taking care of yourself is not embraced. It's like work hard, like those are the things that are respected. Like mental health is considered, it's something wrong with you if you want to seek help, versus that doesn't logically even make any sense. If you feel like something is wrong and you seek help, that would be the logical step for that. So I think it's just a matter of just shifting the perspective and knowing that you can't give what you don't have, and that it's joy is your right, self-care is your right. You know, and this is what you're supposed to do. So it's very simple answer, but it's to just view that these things are not like these are not just things that you do at the moment that you're about to break, but this is just a part of just how you take care of yourself, and to know that you deserve it and that you're worthy. I'm worthy of joy. I'm worthy of taking care of myself, and this is my right. It's my right to be happy, healthy, well, and to survive.
I came across an article very recently about trees and how trees actually have networks under the ground that we can't see, through which they communicate with each other. And they even communicate with family members, in fact, their children. And I think that we need to be a little bit more like networked trees and think about the image of Gaia, Gaia, which is the Greek word for Mother Earth, and root ourselves in Earth and think about how that rootedness is both self-care and care of others. John Donne famously said, "No man is an island." I would say no trans is an island. And we all can connect with others through vital networks, which may not be seen above the ground. So in a way, the interesting thing is, I had a friend remark on a food pic, getting back to food, that I seem to post a lot of food pics with mushrooms. But mushrooms are a really interesting metaphor, I think, for growth, because they're a kind of they're fungus, and they're neither animal, mineral, nor vegetable, and yet they are vital for life on Earth. They're both nutritive, they nourish us as food, but they also clear away garbage and dissolve toxic material. And they manage to do work that cares for the Earth, that cares for Mother Earth at the same time. And so if we were a bit more like mushrooms and trees that were rooted in the earth, yet connected with others, nourished others, and grew roots deep in the ground like really big trees, I think we'd have a better world.
Beautifully stated. Well, you all were wrapping up on time, and I would just like to give a big thank you to the CSW 65, our panelists, Sontaia Briggs and Pauline Park, the UA, and our guests for attending and for being very interactive with us throughout this entire event. I see there's a lot of dialogue in the chat box and your questions were amazing. I also want to mention our co-speakers, the Forbidden Apple podcast with Paleo and Melissa, and also the NGO Committee on Human Rights. Ashley?
Yeah, so as we wrap up, I just wanted to share with you all that me and Shanice came up with this event just because we wanted to challenge trauma narratives. As social work students, we are being trained in being mental health providers. And so a lot of what we do is strength-based. It's highlighting resilience. It's highlighting the joy of being who you are, so that you are rooted in yourself and you can move forward with the trials and tribulations that happen in life. So our speakers were wonderful. Go ahead and follow them on their social medias. Pauline posts good food pics. I kind of want to see now. And Sontaia also has a website. So we will be coming out with a post program so that we can continue the conversation on this. Bruce, did you want to have any concluding remarks as the director of the UUA?
Well, thank you also very much for being here. It is great to see such a great audience and really a wonderful presentation. Just know that our office continues to stand for diversity and inclusion of all kinds. We are all people. We all need to be respected. We believe in the inherent worth and dignity of everyone. And we are very happy that you're here with us in this effort to include all diversity and respect us all. Thank you.